My name is David Hanrahan. I represent All Star Video. The address of the company is 55 Park Avenue West, South Weymouth, Massachusetts, 02190. The phone number of the company is 617-331-8881. It is May 28th, approximately 11:10. We are here at the offices of Goodwin, Proctor & Moore at 53 State Street in Boston for the deposition of Dr. Homburger in the matter of Norma R. Broin et al. Plaintiffs versus Philip Morris Companies, Inc. et al. Defendants. This case is currently pending in the Circuit Court of the 11th Judicial Circuit in Fort Dade County, Florida, General Jurisdiction Division. Case number 91-49738, CA22. You have the attorneys please introduce themselves.
Mary Margaret Schneider from Stanley M. Rosenblatt, PA, for the plaintiffs.
Billy Randall from Shook, Harding & Bacon with Philip Morris and Norway Tobacco Companies.
Steve Klugman from Debevoise and Plimpton for the Council for Tobacco Research, USA, Inc.
David Alden from Jones Day Revison Code for defendant R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company.
Robert Northrop, Shook, Harding & Bacon for Philip Morris and Norway.
Peter Johnson, Debevoise and Plimpton for Council for Tobacco Research, USA, Inc.
And say that you can swear on the witness.
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give for the colloquy and actions shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
So help you God.
Doctor, please state your name.
My name is Freddy, F-R-E-D-D-Y, Homburger. H-O-M-B-U-R-G-E-R.
Can you get a little more treble in there and cut the bass down? Is there any way of doing that? It's a little muddy. If it's possible. I don't know. Try it and see what it goes. All right.
I was born in St. Gall, Switzerland on February 8, 1916.
Where did you attend medical school?
I went to medical school in Geneva, Switzerland, and for 1 year in Vienna, Austria.
And when did you come to the United States from Switzerland?
I came to the United States on June 23rd, 1941.
Okay. Take us through your training and your career in the United States.
At the beginning, I came for a 1-year fellowship in pathology at Yale, and I stayed for 2 years and subsequently was stuck after Pearl Harbor for another 5 years, during which I spent 2 years at the Thorndike Laboratory of Harvard University Medical School in internal medicine, and 3 years at the Memorial Hospital and Sloan Kettering Institute in New York in cancer research, and at Cornell at the same time as an instructor. I then went to Tufts University in Boston to start a cancer research and cancer control unit in its medical school in 1948, I believe it was by then. And 10 years later, I left Tufts to found my own organization, Bioresearch Institute and Bioresearch Consultants, and in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I became, a few years later, a research professor in pathology at Boston University School of Medicine, which I am still to this day. I am board qualified in pathology and internal medicine, and I'm board certified in toxicology, and that was, I believe, in 1982.
And while at Tufts, what kind of work did you do?
At Tufts, I started a cancer research unit which consisted of one basic research laboratory where animal research was done at the Tufts Medical Center, and 2 affiliated chronic disease hospitals, one in Cambridge, one in Roxbury, where we had access to advanced cancer patients and experimented with the early phases of chemotherapy.
And what kind of work have you done at Boston University?
At Boston University, I was mostly involved in pathology, in teaching, and of course all my work at the Bioresearch Institute and Bioresearch Consultants was done while I had an appointment at Boston University.
And you still currently have an appointment with Boston University?
I still am a senior scientist at the Mallory Institute of Pathology at Boston City Hospital and a research professor in the Department of Pathology of Boston University School of Medicine.
Tell us when it was that you became interested in the study of cancer and particularly causes of cancer.
Well, at the time when I obtained a position at the Sloan Kettering Institute and Memorial Hospital, it was very hard for physicians to find positions because it was the end of the war and everybody returned. So it wasn't really by choice and first preference, but the opportunity was offered me to have a job at Memorial Hospital and Sloan Kettering Institute and Cornell, and so I took it, and I was fascinated from the very start, not only by the problem, which is still with us, but also by the extremely advanced technology that was then already available in this highly specialized situation.
How did it come about that you started doing work which was funded by the Council for Tobacco Research?
That is a long story which begins with my friendship with Dr. C.C. Little, who became the director of the Council for Tobacco Research after his retirement from the Jackson Laboratory in Bar Harbor, Maine. I needed an advisory council at the Tufts University situation because this was new and very, what is the word, very difficult to integrate in the existing system of the university. So I thought of Dr. Little, who was then very renowned as a geneticist, and he was very happy to serve as an advisor to our unit. And then he suggested that some of our personnel spent a month or 2 each summer at the Jackson Laboratory in their summer program, and this we did. And he asked me in 1948, the year after the big fire in Bar Harbor, to give a talk at his institution. And both my wife and I were fascinated with Maine, bought some land, built a house there in 1952, and spent every summer working with the Jackson Laboratory as long as Little was in charge. That is why when he became the director of research for the Council for Tobacco Research, he chose our organization as one of the first ones that they supported.
And what was the Jackson Laboratory? Tell me a little bit about that.
The Jackson Laboratory was then a pioneering laboratory in research on genetics of mice and also beagle dogs. And Little was probably the world authority on mouse genetics. And cancer research was one of their interests because some of their strains developed tumors and others did not. And I became very much interested in genetics of experimental laboratory animals by this contact.
Okay. I take it when you first began doing work funded by the Council for Tobacco Research, you had a lot of respect for Dr. Little.
I did.
Okay. Did that ever change?
Well, it changed as he changed in his attitude towards the job he obtained from the Council for Tobacco Research. And when I argued with him that he should insist on having the council put aside a fund in escrow for his salary so he could be free to do whatever he felt was the right thing to do. He said that he liked the position, that he didn't want to risk to lose it, and that he could do what he pleased because, and I quote, my sarcophagus is built. And from then on, I gradually realized that he was not only a great man, but also opportunistic. And my attitude didn't change as far as he, as a friend and human being, was concerned, but I didn't trust his judgment in scientific matters anymore.
When did you first begin doing research which was funded by the Council?
Excuse me, was there an answer to that question?
Doctor, is when did you begin doing research funded by the Council for Tobacco Research?
That was at the time when Dr. Little retired and became director of the Council for Tobacco Research, and was probably 1956 or so.
So in the sometime in the 1950s.
Sometime in the late 1940s or early 50s.
Would you tell the jury a little bit about the work that you began doing, which was funded by the Council for Tobacco Research?
Well, the basic idea was to find a disease model in an experimental animal that could be tested for smoke inhalation. And in the first instance, we started out with mouse skin paintings, which was at the time the only method to get cancer induced with tars from cigarettes in mice. That Winder did in 1953. And then we began to develop a smoking machine with the intent of being able to expose animals to smoke in a way which approached that to which, in which smokers are exposed to smoke. And all that started at about the same time and was carried on for many years before the smoking machine was eventually developed to the extent that we thought it was useful in 1969.
Okay. And what kind of research, or describe for the jury the research that you did with the smoking machine?
And then we tried to see what happened if mice and rats were exposed to smoke. And we found very quickly that both species were very susceptible to the toxicity of the smoke and died in a relatively short period of time before it would have been possible to develop cancer. Then, by accident, we got approached by Dr. Ray Whitney, who was interested in developing inbred strains of Syrian hamsters. And she became associated with our institution. And so we exposed Syrian hamsters to the smoke, and we found very quickly that the Syrian hamster was much more resistant to smoke toxicity and could tolerate and even seemed to like large doses of smoke inhaled. So there was an opportunity of developing a system if we could produce cancer or pre-cancerous conditions in the respiratory tract of these animals, which in the course of years we did.
What kind of cancers did the hamsters develop?
In the susceptible strain, about half of them developed carcinomas or precancerous lesions of the larynx, the upper respiratory tract, and some changes in the lungs, which indicated that smoke did reach the lungs, but to a much lesser degree than the other areas of the respiratory tract.
What is the larynx?
The larynx is the proximal end of the windpipe where the voice is formed.
And what was the significance in the hamsters of some smoke reaching the lungs with respect to the animal model that you were trying to develop?
Well,
Objection to the form.
I didn't hear.
He just objected to the form. You can go ahead and answer the question, Doctor.
Well, if the smoke had not reached the lungs, there would have been no histological change to be seen. And in all animals that smoked, there were some infiltrations with mononuclear cells in the lungs which showed a mild inflammation, and was proof that some of the smoke did reach the lungs.
Okay. And how did the hamster as an animal model with respect to the smoking and lungs compare with the human model or human beings?
Well, I wouldn't like to comment on that.
Okay. Did the hamsters have any differences with their respiratory system, which you noted with respect to when you compared hamster respiratory systems to humans' respiratory systems?
Oh, yes.
Object to the form.
The hamster has a very tiny respiratory system, being a small animal, and humans have a rather wide approach to the lungs through the bronchi. So the hamster would never get the same relative amount of smoke into its lower respiratory tract that could be expected to enter the human lung.
Did there come a time when you reported the results of your finding that you were able to produce cancer of the larynx in hamsters who were smoking to the tobacco industry?
Objection, leading.
Tell me about that as far as what happened. Doctor, my question is, I would like for you to tell the court and the jury what happened when you attempted to publish the results of the study where you found that cancer of the larynx in hamsters who had been exposed to smoke.
Objection to the form.
We wrote the paper, and we sent the paper for their approval to the Council for Tobacco Research, and its then research director, Robert Hockett.
And what happened once you sent the paper to Mr. Hockett?
And they objected to certain terms which we used in that paper.
Okay. What did they object to, and how was that communicated to you?
There was a letter from Mr. Hoyt, who was then the director of the Council for Tobacco Research, pointing out that we had not fulfilled our end of the contract, which gave the Tobacco Council control of our data and equipment and know-how.
And what happened after that?
After I responded to that letter, Mr. Hoyt suggested that Robert Hockett and a lawyer by the name of Ed Jacob should visit me and discuss this further.
And did you ever have any discussions with Mr. Hockett and Mr. Jacob?
They came to my summer place in Maine in July or August of 1973 to discuss this matter.
What happened when they came to see you in Maine?
They told
Objection to the...
What happened when Dr. Hockett and Mr. Jacob came to see you in Maine?
they expressed their disapproval of certain terms we use, namely cancer or microinvasive cancer. And they suggested that we should use only the term pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia and not ever the term cancer.
Did they say anything else to you?
I beg your pardon.
Did they say anything else to you?
Mr. Jacob at one point of the discussion said, you realize that if you were to publish this as you wish to do it, you would never get a penny from the Council for Tobacco Research.
What happened after the meeting in Maine when Mr. Hockett and Mr. Jacob came to see you?
I can answer that very simply. I changed the paper to conform to their wishes and submitted it to them for approval.
And was it approved?
Yes.
And was it published?
It was published, but when the gullies came back to us, I changed it back to its original form, the way we wanted it to see published, and that's the way it was published.
Okay. Why did you change it back to its original form?
Because I believe that the scientific evidence was clearly that cancer had been induced and therefore should not be masqueraded as a more benign situation.
When you use the word "we" with respect to the research that you did with respect to the hamsters and the cancer that they had of the larynx, who was involved in the research that you were doing?
It was Dr. Bernfeld, Dr. Rutsfield, and Dr. Soto that did the scientific work with myself.
Were there other physicians or pathologists who reviewed the slides that you were commenting upon in this paper, which had cancer?
Yeah.
Objection to the form.
And who were the others that were
Well, I have
reviewed the
forgotten
slides?
some of the names, but there were at least 6 other pathologists who looked at this, including Dr. Huburn of MIT, and you have in your records that we gave you the name of some of the others.
Okay, you're referring to some of the papers?
I beg your pardon?
You're referring to papers that you have,
Objection.
which refer to other doctors who reviewed the slides? Is that correct, Don? Whatever, doctor, there were other physicians who reviewed these
other
slides.
physicians, other pathologists experienced in this field who saw these slides. They saw cancer in many of our slides, and in some of them they saw precancerous lesions.
Did you present the results of the study at any scientific meeting?
Yes.
When did you do that?
I did that in 1974 at Atlantic City at the meeting of the American Association of Biological Societies, ASE.
Did you have any press conferences with respect to the findings that you reported at the scientific meeting in Atlantic City?
I was supposed to have a press conference, but it did not take place.
How did that happen?
Objection to the floor, no foundation.
Can you answer the question?
I found out much later in the course of my testimony at the Cipollone case that the public relations person working for the Council of Tobacco Research had made arrangements to cancel my press conference, and that explained why when I went to the assigned room in Atlantic City for the press conference, there was no press conference.
At the time that you went to the room for the press conference, why did you think that there was no press conference?
I have no idea. I thought it was one of these mix-ups that sometimes occur.
Okay. Was it usual or a common occurrence for you to give a press conference on papers?
Not for me personally, I had given one or two, but for everybody who had anything new to report at that meeting, there usually was a press conference.
I'm going to show to you a memorandum which is dated April 22nd, 1974, which I would like for you to take a look at and tell me if that is the memo that you reviewed during the proceedings of the Cipollone case, which indicated to you what had happened to the press conference.
Yes, that's it.
We'll mark this as plaintiff's exhibit number 1.
Judge, we have that exhibit introduced now that was introduced at the deposition.
Was it marked by a number there?
Yes, it's our number 1002 from our exhibit list. It's exhibit 1 to the deposition.
Okay. We'll straighten that out when we do it.
And is this the first time that you had ever come up with results as damaging as this for the Council for Tobacco Research?
Objection.
Yes.
That's all the questions I have, Doctor. Thank you.
This now begins the cross-examination.
Okay.
Work with the CTR, and I'm going to use the phrase CTR even when I refer to the early years when it was known as the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. That won't be confusing to you, will it?
No.
Your first grant from CTR was in about 1955, wasn't it?
That would be about right.
You were one of the very early grantees of CTR, weren't you?
Yes.
And at all times up until about 1969, you had research grants from CTR.
Yes.
And at a later point, 1969 or 1970, you started working by way of contract with CTR,
I
correct?
think it was after 1970.
All right. Now, in your grant work, you would submit grant proposals, and the Scientific Advisory Board of CTR would decide whether or not to fund them. Isn't that correct?
Yeah.
And the work that you had funded by CTR in your grant work was important research, wasn't it?
I believe so.
The work that you had funded by CTR all related to smoking and health, didn't it?
Yes.
And all the various grant proposals that you presented and had funded by CTR had scientific merit, didn't they, Doctor?
Yeah.
Can I ask Dr. Homburger to speak up just a little bit? I'm having trouble here.
Yes.
With your grant research, you were free to conduct your research as you saw fit, right?
Right.
And you were always free to report the results of your research as you thought appropriate, weren't you?
Right.
And you could do with your data whatever you thought should be done, couldn't you?
Of course.
You were free to publish the results of your grant research even when the results could be considered adverse to the tobacco industry, right?
Yes.
And no one ever interfered with your freedom to conduct or report your grant research, did they?
Objection to the form.
Not until later.
Not your grant research, I'm asking.
No, not my grant research.
Okay. Just so we're clear,
Yeah.
no one ever interfered with your freedom to conduct or report your grant research as you thought appropriate, did they?
Right.
And all grantees, to your knowledge, were free to publish the results of their research, isn't that right?
I wouldn't know.
You don't know of any
I
exceptions to that,
don't
do
know
you?
of any exceptions.
Okay. Now, during most of the time that you received grants from CTR, or all the time you received grants from CTR, Dr. Clarence Cook Little was the scientific director, wasn't he?
Not all the time. He died in, well, I don't remember the exact date, but during his tenure I received grants.
And Dr. Little had an excellent reputation in the scientific community, both for his ability as a scientist and for his scientific integrity, didn't he?
Yes.
You called him a great man, didn't you?
Yes.
And you believe he was a great scientist, don't you?
Yes.
You also testified that Dr. Little told you that as scientific director of CTR, he could do whatever he wanted to do, right?
Yes.
Every member of the CTR Scientific Advisory Board with whom you were personally familiar had an excellent reputation in the scientific community, didn't they?
Yes.
And that included, I'll strike that. Now, Dr. Homburger, you've brought a number of documents with you today concerning your relationship with CTR, haven't you?
Yes.
I'm going to...
Well, Dr. Homburger, I'm going to hand you a packet of documents, and I would like for you to look through them. And first of all, tell me if these are the documents you brought with you today. And I'd like to have these marked as Exhibit 1.
Yes, this is what I brought.
Those are the documents you brought today that we discussed yesterday that you had in your files relating to your CTR work.
Yes.
And those documents are authentic documents to the best of your knowledge, aren't they?
Yes.
As a matter of fact, you authored several of those documents, didn't you? And those documents are true and accurate reflections of what you wrote at the time, correct? And the first document on top, which is called a chronology, is a document you testified yesterday you prepared to help refresh your recollection as to what events occurred when, correct?
Right.
Now, Dr. Homburger, would it be fair to say your memory of the events discussed in those documents was more accurate at the time you authored the document than it is now, many years later?
Of course.
All right. Dr. Homburger, I'm going to show you a number of documents today to clarify your recollection. And I want to apologize now if that gets a little tedious. And my intent is simply to try to make sure that I understand your position and that you have a chance to review the documentary record consistent with your position, all right?
Well, I'm getting used to your approach.
Now, Dr. Homburger, you've testified that in a meeting at your home in Maine in July or August of 1973, Dr. Hockett insisted that you call the changes to your hamster's larynxes pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia instead of cancer, right?
Right.
And you testified that at that same meeting at your summer home in Maine in either July or August of 1973, Mr. Jacobs threatened you that you would never receive another penny from CTR if you didn't agree to use the term pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia in your draft JNCI manuscript, right?
Right.
And JNCI stands for the Journal of the National Cancer Institute, correct?
Right.
And that was the manuscript that you testified about on direct examination that you testified you was sent to CTR and precipitated this meeting, correct?
Objection to the floor.
Am I right about that? Okay. And you testified that the only topic of your meeting in July or August of 1973 at your Maine summer home with Mr. Jacob and Dr. Hockett was the two of them trying to convince you to use the term I knew the more times I said it, I would stumble over it. Pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia in that draft JNCI manuscript, correct?
Correct.
And you stated that you would never use that phrase because it was a meaningless phrase, didn't you?
Correct.
And that's your view. It's a meaningless phrase, correct?
Correct.
Dr. Sheldon Summers is a distinguished pathologist, isn't he?
Yes.
And he reviewed your slides and concluded that your hamsters had not developed cancer, didn't he?
I don't know whether that was his conclusion, no.
Is that what he told you?
No.
He didn't tell you that?
No.
Okay.
He argued about the terminology.
And he argued you should use the term pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia, is that correct?
That's correct.
And did he tell you that orally or in writing?
He wrote me a letter. I don't think we ever discussed it in a direct meeting.
Do you have a copy of that letter?
I don't know.
Do you remember when that letter would have been written?
It would have been after the meeting with Hockett and Jacob. You probably have it because you have all the copies of letters of the Council for Tobacco Research.
And Doctor, you testified yesterday that you did not believe there was any way that Dr. Summers' disagreement with you over whether your hamsters had cancer in their larynx was in good faith because he insisted you use the meaningless term pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia in that JNCI manuscript, right?
Objection to the floor.
Okay. And that is your basis for believing that Dr. Summers did not have a good faith scientific disagreement with you, right?
Right.
And that's your only basis for believing that, correct?
No, it's a difference of opinion as to the value of the term pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia.
And you believe that no reasonable scientist would use that term, don't you?
Not for the description of what we saw in these slides.
Well, you believe it's a vague and meaningless term in general, don't you?
I believe that, but that's a personal belief. There may be others besides Dr. Summers who think that there is such a thing in certain situations.
But you don't.
I don't.
Is that the view of your colleague, Dr. Peter Bernfeld?
He's not a pathologist.
Dr. Peter Bernfeld was your longtime co-researcher in your lab, wasn't he?
Yes.
And he worked with you for years, right?
Yes.
And he designed most of your research, didn't he?
Yes, a good deal.
And he wrote most of your lab's, at least the first draft of the research reports.
Yes.
And then you would collaborate with him to finalize it.
Yes.
He was an excellent scientist, wasn't he?
Yes.
And in your opinion, he was a careful scientist.
Oh, yes.
And he wrote accurate scientific reports, didn't he?
Yes.
And he wouldn't use meaningless phrases in his reports, would he?
Well, unless he discussed the opinion of Thomas.
But he wouldn't characterize...
He would not use it, and he wouldn't know what it meant because he was not a pathologist.
Okay. Dr. Dantville was a scientist with a good reputation in the scientific community,
Yes.
wasn't he? Would it surprise you to know that he used the phrase pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia in describing some of the changes to the larynxes of his hamsters?
That wouldn't surprise me, and I think he has every right to do so if he believes it's meaningful.
But you don't think it's
I
meaningful?
don't believe it.
But you don't believe Dr. Dantville was acting in bad faith or unreasonably by using the phrase, do you?
Objection to the form.
And he also used the term cancer induced in his hamsters. He did it before we did it.
As a matter of fact, have you ever read a paper by Dr. Dantville entitled Inhalation Carcinogenesis Proceedings of a Biology Division, Oak Ridge National Laboratories in Gatlinburg, NC?
I heard him give that paper.
You were there when he gave that paper. Do you remember Dr. Dantville stating, in order to have better control of the induced changes, we differentiated 5 stages of epithelial changes in the larynx, Table 6, using the Atlas of Tumor Pathology of the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology as reference. Do you recall him talking about that? Are you familiar with the Atlas of Tumor Pathology of the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology?
I know what it is, yes.
Are you aware that one of the categories they list for cellular changes is pseudoepitheliomatous?
That's probably the case, and they believe it's meaningful. I believe it's not meaningful.
But you don't believe that they're acting in bad faith or
No.
irresponsibly in using the term?
No, but that's not judging an induced cancer in an experimental animal.
Well, that's interesting because I wanted to ask you about Dr. Dantville. He was experimenting with smoke inhalation to hamsters, wasn't he?
Yes.
And that was the subject of this paper you went to listen
Yes,
to talk
so
about.
he used the term, so let him use the term. It doesn't mean anything to me.
Do you recall Dr. Dantville stating, as in human pathology, a differentiation of so-called pseudoepitheliomatous changes and the onset of carcinomas in the larynx is very difficult?
Objection to the form.
I don't recall that. That's ridiculous to expect me to recall a thing like that 20 years later.
Is that a reasonable statement on his part, that it is difficult to differentiate between cancer of the larynx and pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia?
Objection to the form.
How can I think that it's difficult or not difficult if I don't believe it means anything?
In the next sentence, he stated, anyone with long experience in this field and with the above-mentioned atlas or other literature on this subject in mind knows that the criterion for malignancy in the larynx is difficult to explain. Do you agree with him
Yes,
about that?
that's true.
Objection to the form.
Let's just make sure we were clear.
Oh,
You agree with him that it's very difficult to explain the criteria for malignancy of cancer of the larynx?
Absolutely true, and that's why we consulted all these other pathologists.
Actually, Dr. Bernfeld had used the term pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia in reports of research at your own labs for years, hadn't he?
Well, it's possible that would have been simply that I overlooked this, and he got it from Rusfield or Soto or from one of the other pathologists that looked at these slides.
Did you routinely review the reports that Dr. Bernfeld prepared?
Oh, yes.
One final question about that article, Doctor. I would just like to confirm that you recognize that this is Dr. Donenfeld's article that you read at the time and actually went to hear it
At
present.
the time of that meeting, yes. This one too.
Dr. Homburger, would it surprise you if I told you that I have located 8 reports prepared by Dr. Bernfeld of research that was conducted in your lab where he uses the term pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia?
It wouldn't surprise me. I was just sloppy in editing. Today I would take it out.
So you're saying that you were sloppy in editing his reports
Yeah.
for leaving that phrase in?
Yeah, he had no way to know what it was all about. He just took the reports of the pathologists that were given him and put it in as part of his report. He was responsible for the scientific content of the biological point and chemical point, not for the pathology.
But it was a meaningless term, even if it was placed in reports of your lab. Is that correct?
Yes. You're making a big issue out of a meaningful terminology.
Dr. Homburger, I'd like to show you a draft report that you transmitted to Dr. Bob Hockett on May 14th of 1974. I'd like to have that marked as Exhibit 3, please.
I believe to make the record clear, it was March 14th, not May.
The letter says May 14th. Do you remember this report, Doctor?
No, I don't remember the details of these things.
But do you remember your lab generally preparing this report and you sent it to Bob Hockett?
Yes.
And I'd like to call your attention to page 6 of the report. Toward the bottom of the page.
Well, now wait a minute. Here, pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia is defined as proliferation of the squamous epithelium in which there was a downgrowth of cells into the dermis. So we redefine the term, and this is the way we used it. So that doesn't mean that we believe it's meaningful when not explained.
Well, Doctor, I'm a little confused. Let's read on, because don't you then go on to say, in the next sentence, nuclear dysplasia and meiotic activity tended to be more intense than in simple hyperplasia. Correct? page 6, the next
nuclear
sentence.
dysplasia. Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, on page, if you would please look on page 7, midway through that follow-over paragraph, doesn't your report say, in advanced stages, pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia is exceedingly difficult to differentiate from early invasive carcinoma? And that's a report from your lab authored by Dr. Bernfeld, yourself, and Dr. Rusfield, right?
Yes.
And in that report, you state that pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia is very difficult to differentiate from invasive carcinoma, don't you?
Yeah, we state that in the sense that we use pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia here defined as proliferation of the squamous epithelium in which there was downgrowth of cells into the dermis. This is true.
And it was true that you found it difficult to differentiate pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia from cancer.
Yeah, yes, that's true.
Dr. Humber, I want to show you a letter from Dr. Hockett back to you on June 3rd, 1974, and see if you remember this letter.
Judge? Yes? Okay, good time to break. Okay. All right, let's take a short break, folks. Clean coat or something?
No.
Just like this one.
Just like this one.
I'm going to sit down in the next seat and really see if it's cold.
Please do.
You're not cold, Jeff?
Why don't you move? I thought it'd be wonderful to do that. I'm going to try and say that word.
So is Billy.
He dreamt that word.
He practiced it.
Very vaguely. That was after our meeting.
I would like to mark this as Exhibit 4. And Doctor, Exhibit 4 is a letter from Dr. Hockett to you dated June 3rd, 1974 with comments on the paper, draft manuscript I've just shown you, correct?
Yes.
And he states that a composite of the suggestions and comments received by CTR staff and consultants is as follows, and he lists a number of comments, doesn't he?
Yes.
And comment number 5 says, page 6, line 18, and that's the portion we just read, correct?
Yeah.
The term pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia was questioned as to its appropriateness.
Right.
Right. So you utilized the term pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia in a draft manuscript of a paper concerning your hamster work, right?
Yes. I did because they requested me to do it. This was after the meeting with Jacob and Hockett.
And then on June 3rd, 1974, in Exhibit 4, Dr. Hockett writes back to you and questions the appropriateness of the use of the term, doesn't he?
Yeah. But it was their suggestion in the first place.
So your testimony is it was their suggestion in the first place that you use the term, but on June 3rd, 1974, they wrote comments back to you questioning the propriety of using the term?
Objection to the floor.
Absolutely. Doesn't make sense, but that's what happened.
And you thanked Dr. Hockett for his comments on that paper, didn't you?
I must have.
Dr. Homburger, you earlier testified that Dr. Bernfeld had used the phrase pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia in manuscripts, and that when they got by you, that was sloppy editing, correct?
I would think so.
As a matter of fact, Dr. Bernfeld had used that phrase long before you say there was a dispute about using this phrase in 1973, hadn't he?
Probably.
That would not surprise you, would it?
No.
And it wouldn't surprise you if he had used that term repeatedly in draft reports and manuscripts, and you just missed it prior to 1973, correct?
Objection to the floor.
I'm sorry, you answered.
Correct. Obviously, I wasn't as convinced about this meaning or meaninglessness at that time than I am now.
So your views today are different concerning the meaninglessness of the phrase pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia than they were in 1973.
I would not use it now. I would call it pre-invasive carcinoma or something like that.
But you did use it in the 1970s, didn't you?
I obviously let it go by, yes.
And it didn't stick out in your mind, did it? Because you didn't pull it out of any of these papers.
I wasn't particularly concerned until they wanted us to call everything pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia and not call it cancer.
Do you have any document or manuscript where anyone from CTR ever suggests you using the term pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia?
I don't believe so. I think that was all in the discussion.
So your testimony in the Chipolone case and in the testimony yesterday that you would never use the phrase pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia was not quite accurate, was it?
Well, it didn't
Objection to the floor.
apply to those days long gone, and certainly now wouldn't use it.
You wouldn't use it now?
No.
But you did use it then?
I let it slip by. I didn't use it myself, I don't think.
So CTR did not suggest a phrase to you you were unfamiliar with or had never used in papers, did they?
No, but they suggested it to avoid the term cancer.
Contract work and grant work are different methods for supporting scientific research, isn't that true?
True.
And contracts are a common method of supporting scientific research, aren't they?
True.
There are key differences between contract and grant research, aren't there?
Yes.
And they include such factors as the contracting funding agency having a higher degree of control over the design of the research.
Right.
And the contracting agency has some control over the freedom of a contract recipient to publish. Isn't that correct?
Right.
And that's very common, isn't it?
Yes.
And there's also a difference in the ownership of the results between contract and grant, aren't there? In other words, the contracting agency owns the results of the contractor.
Right.
And in a grant, the grant recipient owns the results. Isn't that right?
Right.
And as part of that, any information that can be patented coming out of a contract belongs to the contracting agency, doesn't it?
Objection to the floor.
Now, Doctor, you testified that with respect to your publication to JNCI, that you put in the phrase pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia in your drafts to CTR because you say they insisted on it, and you took them out in the published version. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
And that is your recollection of the events, correct?
Yes.
And you remember taking that phrase out of your paper as clearly as you remember CTR asking you to put it in, don't you?
Yes, I think so.
Doctor, I want to show you an article that you wrote. I'd like to have this marked Exhibit 5. Ask you if you recognize that article.
Yep.
And this is the article you were discussing that you published in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute,
Yes.
correct? And this is the article in which you said CTR insisted you put in the phrase pseudoepitheliomatous, and you refused. You put it in the original draft, and then you took it out of the published version, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That is your testimony? I'd like for you to turn to page 1147 of the article, please, Doctor.
I'm there.
Okay, and I refer you to the second column, the first full paragraph. And did you state in your article, a few larynges of smoke-exposed hamsters also showed chronic inflammation and or squamous metaplasia of the mucous glands, figure 13, right?
Yeah.
And then you said chronic inflammation in a few of the controls was associated with slight epithelial thickening, but never with true hyperplasia. Pseudoepitheliomatous change or papilloma formation, correct?
Okay, so I wanted to be nice to the CTR and left it in one place.
So you did leave it in this article.
Must I?
Objection to the floor.
And so your recollection of the sequence of events of CTR requiring you to put that language in, you putting it in a draft and then taking it out of the draft is mistaken.
Objection to the floor.
No, it's correct except for one instance here. They wanted me to have it everywhere where it now says cancer.
But it was in the paper you submitted, correct?
Objection
And your
to the
testimony to the contrary earlier was mistaken, wasn't it?
Objection to the floor.
No. I took out a lot of pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia and left in one. Those are the facts. I should have said maybe I took it all out except for one.
Doctor, the government sponsors contract research, doesn't it?
Yes.
We're through with that now, Doctor. Contract research is often characterized as more targeted research than grant research, correct? And by targeted, that means the research is directed at a particular scientific issue, right?
Correct.
It's more mission-oriented than grant research.
Yes.
You want to accomplish a given task with a contract, correct?
Yes.
Now, both contract and grant research can be of high scientific merit, isn't that correct?
Possibly, yes.
Now, Dr. Homburger, you have testified that CTR switched your research from a grant to a contract because when you reported the results of your hamster inhalation results to CTR, they wanted to control your right to publish. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Objection to the form and beyond the scope of the direct examination.
That was your testimony to me yesterday, and was your testimony in the Chippewa case, was it?
Objection to the form.
Now, Dr. Homburger, you first reported the results of your hamster inhalation research to CTR in an interim report on April 2nd, 1972. Isn't that correct?
That may be the date you had it there.
Let me show you an item I would like to have marked Defense Exhibit 6. And this is entitled Progress Report for the Current Contract Period and Renewal Application for number 5B with budget of the project entitled The Determination of the Usefulness of the Golden Syrian Hamster as a Model Animal for Inhalation Studies, correct? Mm-hmm. And you submitted that to the Council for Tobacco Research in April 1972, correct?
Yes.
And that was your first report on the inhalation experiments with your hamsters, correct?
I don't know. Was it the first?
I'm afraid you have to tell me.
I really don't know.
He doesn't know.
But I know that as early as 1969 we had data on inhalation effects in hamsters.
But the project which you undertook, which you say eventually caused cancer in the larynxes of the hamsters, is this the first report that you submitted to CTR about that project?
Objection to the form. And I object
frankly
to...
don't.
Let me ask this another way, Doctor. You don't know of any other earlier reports on your hamster inhalation work that is at issue here today that you submitted to CTR, do you?
Oh yes, I submitted data on the effects of the smoking machine exposure in 1969. And that means we did work on that perhaps 10 years earlier.
So you had done work with hamsters for years, but the multiple week inhalation project...
That was the last project.
That's right.
Yeah.
And this was your first report to CTR about that project,
I
wasn't it?
think so, about that project.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Is that right?
That's basically right. Yeah.
Now, you claimed it was Mr. Hoyt from CTR's idea to switch you from a grant to a contract based upon these results you obtained in 1972, right?
Objection to the form.
I don't know whether that was the reason or not. I mean, I have these letters from Hoyt. Where are they?
You have them.
Just so we're clear, Doctor, you're referring back to some of the documents that you brought today as Exhibit 1, correct?
Yes. here is this letter of February 26th of Mr. Hoyt to me, where he describes the basic facts of the contract. And then my answer to him where
Now that was February 1973. That was long after you had already been working on the contract, isn't that correct?
Yes.
And just so we're clear, my question to you was it Mr. Hoyt's idea or your idea that you switched from grant to contract research?
Not my idea.
It wasn't your idea? When was the first time you discussed this idea with anyone at CTR, of switching from grant to contract research?
I really don't know.
Would it surprise you to learn that you first mentioned the idea of whether your work with CTR should be construed as a grant or a contract on October 1st, 1968?
That would be a surprise to me. I don't.
Dr. Homburger, I'm going to mark you what we would like, hand you what we would like to mark Defense Exhibit 6. And you are certainly free to review this whole letter, Doctor, but I'm particularly interested in calling your attention to page 3, the last large paragraph there.
Okay. You want to
Yeah,
stop it?
Chancellor.
You want to stop it for now? Okay. Yeah, I think we'll find this thing.
Well, I don't think this was the first suggestion. I mean, I agreed with Hoyt that the contract might be a better form because it was more expensive to do these long-term inhalation studies than anything we had done before. But I don't think it was the first time we discussed that.
Okay, let me just make sure we're clear. We are now discussing an October 1st, 1968 letter that you sent to Mr. Hockett, Dr. Hockett, who is the Associate Scientific Director at CPR,
Yeah.
correct? And in this letter, you, among other things, you state, we discussed certain administrative aspects of this contract. You point out that within CTR, this contract was actually being handled as a grant. And then you go on for several reasons to explain why you think it would be better to handle this as a contract.
Yeah,
Isn't that right?
That's true.
And one of the reasons was, as you were just saying, that this was going to be a very expensive project, and typically funding agencies spend more money on a contract than they do a grant, correct? And you wanted them to undertake a large-scale contract with you, didn't you? And you think that there may have been prior discussions, but at least as early as October 1st, 1968, you were discussing the possibility of entering into a contract with CTR to do this work. And this was, of course, long before you had any results of your hamster inhalation experiment, which did not start until about 1970, correct?
Yes, but there was a lot of work done on that smoking machine with hamsters long before. which told us that it was feasible, and all of that was done long before we had the contract.
That's right. You had worked with hamsters and inhalation machines for several years,
yes,
but you hadn't undertaken the long-term inhalation experiment, correct?
Right.
I'm sorry, I talked over you. Let me try that again. Although you had worked with hamsters and the inhalation machine for several years, you had not yet undertaken the long-term inhalation experiment in which you eventually concluded that some of your hamsters got cancer.
Correct.
And you didn't start that until sometime around 1970, or 1971 or 1972, did you?
Well, a little earlier maybe, because we had to go for 2.5 years. 71.
As a matter of fact, Dr. Homburger, not only did you write suggesting to CTR on October 1st of 1968 that they enter into a contract with you, you actually prepared a draft contract, which you transmitted to CTR, didn't you? I'd like to have this marked as Exhibit A. Dr. Homburger, I'd like to show you what has been marked as Defendant's Exhibit 8 and see if you can confirm that this is a letter that you sent to Dr. Vince Lasante at the Council for Tobacco Research on December 23rd, 1969. Is this document, as I described it to you, a December 23rd, 1969 letter from you to Vince Lasante at the Council for Tobacco Research, stating encloses a draft of an agreement between the Council for Tobacco Research and Bioresearch Consultants for inhalation studies in Syrian hamsters?
Obviously true, yes.
So you sent a draft contract to CTR on December 3rd, 1969 for this work.
But you know, may I draw your attention to another letter of mine to Mr. Hoyt of March 2, 1973.
Actually, I plan to talk to you about that letter a little bit later, if that's all right, Doctor.
All right.
I'd like to take this chronologically. Furthermore, you actually submitted this draft contract to your lawyer, who made changes to it, and you sent those changes to CTR, didn't you?
I don't remember any of them.
I would like to have this marked Defendant's Exhibit 9. And Dr. Homburger, is this a letter from you to Dr. Lasante at the Council for Tobacco Research, dated January 6, 1970, which the cover letter states, enclosed are the comments recently received from our council regarding the contract form of CTR. We hope that his suggestions will be acceptable to your lawyers.
Yes.
And I'd like to call your attention in particular to page 2 of your lawyer's letter to you, dated January 2nd, 1969, which is part of Exhibit 9. I'd like to call your attention to page 2. Point number 5 that your lawyer makes, and he states, we note that there is no language in your proposed draft with regard to the fact that the findings made by consultants in the course of this study belong to the council, COUNCIL. You may wish to refer to the council's proposed contract and give the council the assurance with regard to this point. Is that what it says?
Yeah.
So your lawyer was pointing out to you in 1970, and you transmitted his comments to CTR, they need to make sure in their contract with you that they were clear they owned the results, right?
Objection to the form.
Hold on right there. Hold on.
Yes.
Okay. What page and line are you at?
80, line 5.
Okay.
That's the last thing we heard.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Which was thank you.
Then
Okay, that's a good place to stop at the moment.
going into another exhibit.
Yeah. You want to go to 83, line 1? Well, we can do that. That's not that far yet. If that's a good spot for you to stop. Okay. Oh, is that what? I have to read this. Yeah, but I'm trying to look at this thing and see where they go with it. Let me see how many references they're making.
I'm sorry.
I'm just mumbling. Put down Judge mumbled. Yeah.
Look at mine, 683, change comments.
Just remember, friends, if you don't ever have a sense of humor, it ain't worth it. Okay, let's see. Well, there's a lot of colloquy in here, too. But that one reference on page 81, I'm not really that much concerned with, considering the total context of it. So what was page 83, line?
Look at 83, line 6.
Line 6 is where you want to stop? Or 4, I guess. Yeah. All right, let's run it to that point. And cut out the colloquy. Well, see, the colloquy comes after that, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's actually...
All right, we'll just run it to that point.
83, line 4?
Yeah.
Play it from here and stop.
From here to 83, line 4.
I'd like to mark this next exhibit, Exhibit 10. And Dr. Homburger, on June 19, 1970, you sent Exhibit 10, what is now marked as Exhibit 10, to Mr. Hoyt, who was the Executive Director of the Council for Tobacco Research, a cover letter enclosing 2 signed copies of the agreement with BioResearch Institute, contract number 4, and BioResearch Consultants, contract number 5, didn't you?
Seems to be.
And this was the contract that covered your hamster inhalation experiments that are the subject of your testimony today. Isn't that correct?
Objection to the form.
I'm sorry, I think you all may have talked over each other. Is your answer to that yes?
Yes.
So, Dr. Homburger, so we're clear, you suggested at least as early as October 1968 that you perform hamster inhalation work by means of contract with CTR, didn't you?
Yes.
And you prepared the contract, didn't you?
Yes.
And your lawyer suggested changes to the contract, including CTR's ownership of the findings, and you forwarded those changes to CTR, didn't you?
Yes.
And you signed the contract and sent it to CTR on June 19, 1970, didn't you?
Yes.
And you didn't send CTR a report on the results of your hamster inhalation work under this contract until April 2nd, 1972, did you?
I don't know the date. Do you have it here? I sent that.
Can we see the exhibits, please? I would like to refer you back to exhibit number 6, Doctor, that we talked about earlier. That is your first report to CTR regarding the results of this inhalation work. Isn't that correct? So you had a contract with CTR to do this work for nearly 2 years when you finally submitted the results to CTR, correct?
Yes.
So the fact that your CTR funding for the hamster inhalation work was no longer a grant but became a contract on June 19, 1970 had nothing to do with the results of the inhalation work because the work hadn't been done yet, had it?
I don't understand you.
Let me try again. The fact that you were doing this research by means of contract instead of a grant was not at all connected to the results of the work, which had not even been done yet.
Yeah, that's correct. But now may I make reference to my letter of March 2nd?
I promise you I'm going to get to that letter if you can just wait.
Okay? All right. We have concluded that that's enough for today. Okay? Which you're very sorry to hear. We will resume tomorrow at 9 o'clock, usual time. Same thing. We'll try to get to you as early as we can. We have